Hello everyone, welcome to my Resident Evil Revelations 2 Survival Difficulty, No Healing walkthrough. This is Buried 2, and Buried 2 is a very easy episode, mainly because you're going to be in stealth most of the time, because the game definitely encourages you to be in stealth, which is a really good thing. I mean, it still doesn't justify the fact that a lot of the enemies are bullet sponges, and the combat on this game can be very awkward at times, and the boss fights are pretty shit. But I'm just glad that the game encourages you to save up on your ammunition in a way that makes sense, with a proper stealth system, unlike in the older Resident Evil games, where the only reason you ran past the enemies was because they were poorly designed, they were simplistically designed, they did not present as much of a threat, and you just ran right past them and exploited the holes in their designs. And this is what led you to do those games knife only. I mean, I'm not including Resident Evil 3, the original version. I'm mainly talking about Resident Evil 1, Resident Evil 2, Resident Evil 1 Remake, and Resident Evil 2 Remake. Aside from other Resident Evil games where using such a minimalist restriction just seems possible. But that is a pretty stupid incentive, and if the developers are going to be glamorizing knife only, that just goes to show that they wanted you to find the holes in their designs and therefore use it to their advantage, rather than actually putting effort into a proper system that actually feels believable, like a stealth system. And I do like the use of stealth in this game, even if at times the stealth doesn't always work, because the enemies can spot you randomly out of nowhere. I say randomly, I mean it's mainly when you think you're hidden safely behind cover, and then the enemies just spot you over the cover somehow. But that was only with one Revenant in Buried 2, the rest were pretty simple. I will say, though, I kind of wish my path was better optimized, because I haven't played this game in a while. So a lot of it, I was just kind of looking at the paths and not really picking the best opportunity to go for them so that it would look like a very streamlined path. So that sucks, but at least I managed to get the job done in the end. But these Revenants are pretty cool, because as much as they are damage sponges, the fact that they go down instantly from a sneak kill is really well designed. Because, again, the game wants you to save up on a lot of ammunition and save up on a lot of customization kits so that you actually have the tools necessary to deal with the encounters. And, sadly, the game doesn't really feel well designed to really make that known in certain parts. And also, with the game embracing certain restrictions like invisible enemy mode and countdown mode, and they make you do it after you beat the new game, and also like the inclusion of those modes in general just kind of discredits the whole importance of these kind of designs. Like, there's a lot I need to talk about with regards to the idea that Revelations 2 decides to embrace really stupid game modes that I feel were meant to be the prime focus of Revelations 2, and not really the baseline grounded difficulty modes of survival difficulty, for instance. But there's a bit I'll say on that later on, but I'll not talk about it right now. But we have a couple of enemies in this stealth encounter. This guy right here, I don't know how he didn't spot me just then, but he's always going to be walking around this house, so he's the first guy you'll want to take out. There are definitely a couple of moments in this particular encounter where somehow the enemies don't spot me. And I think I noticed this kind of behavior before, and I was going to include it as part of a video, but I just deleted it because I didn't think it was that important. But the perception on these Revenants, sometimes they just don't see you, and I'm not too sure why. And I think it's mainly because when you're crouched, you're not inside of their vision cone, and maybe the vision cone of these enemies is programmed a little differently. I don't know. But regardless, don't let that go to your head, and also do not rely upon these bushes. The bushes do not conceal you whatsoever. I don't know why they bothered including these bushes here, if it seems like it's there purely for the purpose of hiding from the enemies, when that mechanic doesn't exist at all. Seems like a very odd choice, but whatever. Just hide around corners and then wait for the right opportunity to take out these Revenants. That guy will always pace back and forth along that short path, and then this guy will always patrol around these destroyed buildings. And it's all pretty simple, but I'm just going to go on different tangents, and I'd like to talk about a new enemy type that is introduced in this episode, and that you'll be seeing in Episode 3 and Episode 4 of Barry's campaign, and also in Claire 4. there is an enemy type known as a Glasp, and the Glasp is basically an invisible enemy type. It's a properly designed invisible enemy, even if the whole mechanic of Natalia pointing out where the enemy is so that you can shoot it as Barry is poorly programmed, and that's why you'll just want to rely upon using Natalia's bricks to your advantage, because you can actually see the aura of the Glasp, and therefore not deal with that problem whatsoever. But overall, I would say the Glasps are one of the scariest enemies in the game. They're very intimidating, and they still intimidate me to this day. I'm not a big fan of certain bugs like bees, for instance, and wasps, and at times the Glasp can kind of feel on par with those kind of insects. And plus, it moves around in a very creepy fashion. And when the vision blurs and you're hearing the buzzing, it can be very intimidating. But that is one thing I can definitely appreciate about this game. It's the glass. But unfortunately, because of the inclusion of invisible enemy mode, it completely discredits the whole role the glass was supposed to play, which is meant to be this intimidating threat. And the fact that they're a properly designed invisible enemy, when you're going to make every single enemy invisible, every single enemy just feels like a Glasp, but more annoying. So therefore, you're making the glass a more annoying enemy when you're playing on this kind of mode, or even when you know that this kind of mode exists in Revelations 2. Subconsciously, it almost forces you to interpret the glass as a very annoying enemy, just like with every other enemy when they're invisible. And the thing is that the enemies, when they're invisible, they're not well designed. You just have to look at grass that just moves ambiently, and then the enemies also appear whenever they attack, and then you're also having to rely upon your AI partner to expose the enemies for a bit, but the AI is already very clunky as it is, because when they are just being controlled by the game, they move around so much, they don't shine their flashlight or point out enemies properly, and this is also a problem as well, because in Mutated Pedro's boss fight, I'm having to switch to Natalia a lot to actually see the correct weak spot I am supposed to shoot on Mutated Pedro as Barry. But the thing is that if you're playing as Claire or Barry and you're telling your AI partner to wait, if you're moving around, the AI is also turning, because they're programmed to face in the direction that you're trying to go, and they're kind of programmed to look at you, basically. So you swap to them, like say for instance, you're trying to swap to Natalia during Mutated Pedro's boss fight. Like, you left Natalia in a position where she's looking in a direction that's favorable, but then you swap to her just out of the blue, and she's looking in a completely different direction, and it leads to very disorienting gameplay, because not only do I have to waste time trying to turn the camera so that I can actually see where Mutated Pedro is, but then I have to identify where exactly his weak spot is, and when you're trying to see Pedro's aura through walls, it can be very hard to discern where exactly his weak spot is, because some of his weak spots are placed very close to each other, so that's why you need to see Pedro's model, not see him through the wall, in order to understand where his weak spot is. And it just leads to very clunky gameplay, basically. And, it's that kind of clunky gameplay with the AI that is one of the main factors that makes invisible enemy mode tedious, boring, stupid, clunky, cumbersome, silly. There are a lot of words I can give for that. And invisible enemy mode on this game, I don't think it's as bad as invisible enemy mode from Resident Evil 1 Remake, because with Resident Evil 1 Remake, because of the fact that the game is designed for knife only on the other difficulty modes, and the enemies are simplistically designed, I just feel like they used invisible enemy mode in Resident Evil 1 Remake as a cheap substitute to actual hard work put into refining the animations, and putting in actual stun animations, putting in actual lethal enemy types, and they pretty much use that as a way to justify using the weapons in Resident Evil 1 Remake, because going for the weapons in Resident Evil 1 Remake is a complete waste of time, because the enemies are set up in ways that just allow you to run right past them. They aren't very intimidating, and they take up a lot of space in your inventory when you're actually trying to go for the weapons in Resident Evil 1 Remake, and it just leads to a very unoptimized route. And unfortunately, with invisible enemy mode, because they decided to use that as their sort of cheap way to create horror, because back then, outdated Capcom just embraced all the wrong tropes with survival horror, and they instead embraced a lot of smoke and mirror aspects with their horror, it just led to a lot of the problems of Resident Evil 1 Remake being amplified even further. And the game is going to be even more clunky with these kind of restrictions for invisible enemy mode. Whereas in Revelations 2's case, I feel like the context in which you judge invisible enemy mode is slightly different compared to Resident Evil 1 Remake. I mean, yes, like with Revelations 2's invisible enemy mode, it's going to present with the exact same problems as Resident Evil 1 Remake, where you're completely discrediting the role of these kind of enemies. You're going to make the enemies have all these cheap advantages. You're going to make the gameplay look clunky, and you're just going to be undermining like true horror. Like, invisible enemies can be done properly in horror games, it's just most of the time developers don't know how to use them correctly. And the glasps represent one of the few moments where a developer actually utilizes an invisible enemy correctly. But then, when you make every other enemy invisible, it's like, why? Why are you trying to do that and completely undermine the whole point of these enemies? And also, the fact that you're making invisible enemy mode more practical to do on co-op is another reason why this mode doesn't make any sense for Revelations 2. So overall, I don't like invisible enemy mode, and it's the same with countdown mode. And the thing is that they're already defaulted to like survival difficulty, and also the game forces you to pick certain loot. Like the game pre-selects certain loot for you to actually use, so you can't be experimental as much. And you get different skills, you get different weapons and the like. Yeah, it just feels a little too arcadey for me, and it doesn't feel as interesting as some other DLCs or any other gameplay modes, like for instance what Resident Evil 7 provided. But I'd mentioned co-op, and this actually leads me on to a tangent I was going to discuss. And this relates to Ether greatly. And I will say though, Ether had actually watched my footage of Claire 2, and he was willing to start a discussion with me with regards to why he feels that the Lycans are better than the Afflicted. It's just he said that he would explain his points, but he would rather explain his points in a space where both of us could actually lay out our arguments. So this could be in, say, for instance, the comment section of YouTube, or also in a live chat replay session, which I totally understand his points. And I do agree with him that having that kind of space is definitely helpful. But going back to what I was saying, I remember when Ether premiered his Helena's campaign run of pistol only for Resident Evil 6, and we were getting into a discussion about the chopper boss from Resident Evil 6, because I've said many times that the chopper boss on Resident Evil 6 for Chapter 3 of Chris's campaign is the worst boss ever made in the entire Resident Evil series. And the thing is that Ether's counter-argument was that since the fight is less awkward in co-op and it actually works a lot better than in a single player, you can't say it's the worst boss ever because of the fact that it's possible to do on co-op in a practical manner. But I'm not really sure I understand Ether's reasoning, because his reasoning for that is very confusing, because the whole idea of co-op and the idea that you're supposed to judge a section based on co-op and not on single player doesn't sit right with me. And the thing is that it's a general rule of thumb to judge an experience on single player as sort of like the baseline way to play. That's how it is with the design philosophies that go in place when designing a game. Like, normally what developers do is they always try to playtest an experience on single player before actually adding in the co-op feature. And if the section is designed for single player, then most likely it's going to be designed for co-op. But if it's not designed for single player, but it's designed for co-op, you've therefore neglected an important subgroup to consider, because most people don't have access to friends, most people don't have access to internet connection, so you can't ignore that subgroup at all. And also, if the developers are going to be exerting a lot more effort on co-op, why would they bother putting in the single player mode anyway? And also, like, having a co-op partner can be on par with that of using exploits, or also with using mods, for instance. Like, the co-op partner presents a favorable variable that was not initially designed for that sequence, and therefore it changes up the flow of that encounter. So because of the fact that it presents as such a significant change to the flow of the encounter, it's a confounding variable. You can't have such confounding variables like that when actually judging a section. And, like, again, judging a game based on single player is always the baseline way to judge the game. Like, the developers are always going to make sure that the game is designed for single player, and if it doesn't satisfy that initial criteria, then therefore they have made a very flawed section. It's no different to the idea of harder difficulties. Like, people say, oh, if it's buried on easier difficulties and not on the harder difficulties, that's perfectly fine. But it's like, when you're playing on the hardest difficulties, you are noticing a lot of the holes present with the game. You are noticing some of the designs that the developers neglected to actually refine a lot better. So if the hardest difficulty is going to be poorly designed, and the developers opted to put that difficulty in, thinking that it was accommodating for the actual gameplay that they designed, then they have therefore failed to make a functional game experience. I mean, Seraphim17 talked about this tangent in his Nier Automata walkthrough. I think it was specifically for Chapter 7 of 2B's campaign. And I 100% agree with him. Like, if you make a hardest difficulty shit based on nothing but poor designs, and the hardest difficulties are meant to amplify the poor designs even more, and it's clear that the developers didn't play test the game properly before even thinking about the whole idea of putting in a harder difficulty, then they've therefore released a broken product. And also, to provide another example, relating to the whole idea of Ether saying that if the experience is designed for co-op, despite the fact that the experience on single player is garbage and the entire game is meant to be played from single player, then it follows the exact same structure as what I've laid out. I mean, it's no different to, like, the speed limit, for instance. I mean, do you know how speed limits are actually set in the US, for instance? They basically use something called the 80% rule, where they examine the speeds of every single car going on that highway, and whatever represents the 80th percentile value, like the max value that represents the 80th percentile, is what they use for the actual speed limit of that highway. And this is a problem because the actual design speed of the highway, meaning the speed that is implied based on the actual design of the highway, based on its length and width, it may not always be equal to the value that is set by the 80th percentile rule. So there are a lot of moments where, say, for instance, you're on a highway and it feels complementary to the idea of having 70 miles per hour based on the actual width of the highway, based on the number of lanes, and based on the actual length of the highway. But the 80th percentile rule sets the speed limit to 55 miles per hour, which is not the same as 70 miles per hour. So think of it like that when thinking of the whole idea of always making sure that you are judging the game based on the single player first, then you're judging it based on the co-op. The co-op is superfluous. The single player represents the actual design of the game. Like, the single player is almost on par with that of the design speed of the highway, whereas the 80th percentile rule could almost be on par with that of the idea of co-op. And that's why I'm saying the whole argument of saying that this fight is better on co-op and not on single player doesn't make any sense, because as part of the standard norm for judging games, you always judge it based on the single player mode. Like, typically the developers design the single player mode, then they design the co-op. You can't just ignore the single player mode, because then you're like, why do you bother including the single player mode then? Like, if you're going to be judging it based on the co-op, then you're essentially saying that the single player is completely irrelevant. But then it's like, why did the developers bother putting in the single player mode? Like, that is what makes Ether's argument a little confusing. And it's why I can't really agree with him when he says that the chopper boss from Resident Evil 6 is not the worst boss in Resident Evil 6 because of the fact that it's practical to do on co-op. Like, if you have to specifically go on co-op to get a properly functional experience, and you've therefore made a shit boss fight, it should be good on single player and co-op. And if you failed one of them, that therefore invalidates the whole argument of using the whole idea of co-op as an excuse to actually say that this fight is properly designed, and not as bad as some other fights in the Resident Evil series. But that's what I have to say about that particular tangent with regards to Ether. And I will say, though, that whole discussion we were getting into with regards to the whole idea of single player and co-op was a very fun discussion, and there are at least 3 points where Ether brought up the whole idea of co-op as being a way to say, oh, the chopper boss is not so bad. And on the third time he said that, I said in a silly outburst, if you mention co-op one more time, I'm going to flip. Like, every time I think back to that point where I said that comment, I always laugh, because it has to be one of the funniest ways I've actually tried to convey that level of outburst in a funny manner. Yeah, it was a really enjoyable discussion I had with Ether. But that's all I have to say about that particular tangent. And I'm going to go on a different tangent, but right there, I'm aiming upward because that is a path that you can actually take if you killed Pedro in Claire 2, which I don't recommend doing because it takes forever to do, and I don't even know if the weak spots play a role in Pedro's boss fight when you're encountering him in Claire 2. And without Natalia's ability to see the weak spots, you're going to be wasting a lot of ammo on Pedro. And it's probably something the developers want you to do on like New Game Plus or something, or maybe on like some earlier difficulty. But I did kill Mutant Pedro in Claire 2 in my pistol-only run, which is a run I shouldn't have done in the first place because back then I think I stuck a little too much to a bad crowd that just favored the whole idea of minimalist, stupid, silly runs that have nothing to do with actual skillful play. But I've already talked about this issue, so I'm not going to flog this dead horse any longer unless I bring it up again. But the pistol-only run, I wish I hadn't done it in the first place. That was back during a time where I was still quite gullible to the whole idea of what defines functional good gameplay. But I will say, though, that this pistol-only run that I did years ago has kind of influenced my perceptions towards some customization kits in particular. Like for Berry 2, I skip out on one customization kit that is protected by a whole bunch of glasps, and I do skip out on Mora's expansion bag, but I don't think I'll need it so much for the later chapters of Barry's campaign, so it shouldn't be that much of a big deal. But I feel like regardless of whether you're doing like a normal run of Revelations 2 or like the pistol-only run, which I really don't recommend you do unless you have a hatred towards games or you have no love for games whatsoever, I feel like regardless of what you do, you're always going to end up using very unorthodox strategies that just look very stupid, and you just have to wonder, like, do the developers really want you to use these strategies? Or do you really have to disrespect the game like that to even have the mentality to do those kind of strategies? Because I feel like on my pistol-only run, I had a better understanding of the game, a bit, but at the same time, it was to the expense of this game, which was definitely something I look back on and really regret ever doing whatsoever. And that's all I have to say about that, and I'll just go on a different tangent. But by the way, this sequence right here, that Slinger who's throwing those projectiles at me, he's broken in this part, because he's going to be able to throw his projectiles through the building. You will see it right here, like, watch. I'm going to turn around to deal with this Revenant, and watch the projectile. Watch. Look at that, it went right through the geometry. How the hell did the developers miss that when playtesting the sequence? This building, for whatever reason, does not have any collision on it when that Sploder is using his projectiles. It's almost like the Sploder is not meant to be in this section. It's like they added this guy in arbitrarily without properly playtesting the sequence. So be very careful when you are near that building, because he will hit you through the building. It's one of the things that definitely pisses me off about Revelations 2. There are definitely moments where the enemies have the ability to hit you through the geometry. And I feel like I noticed it a lot more in this game compared to any other Resident Evil game. I mean, aside from Resident Evil 4, of course, because the Plaga-type A's were very bullshit at actually hitting you through the geometry, because the hitbox was never turned off through the geometry. And I don't know if the older Resident Evil games had this whole feature where they disabled hitboxes through geometry, because I never really noticed a lot of situations in the older Resident Evil games before Resident Evil 4 where the enemies can hit you through the geometry. I mean, it's probably because I haven't put myself in that kind of situation where the enemies are going to be able to hit me through the geometry. But it could be that a lot of the enemy types that you encountered in the older Resident Evil games didn't really have ranged capabilities that could allow them to clip through the geometry. I mean, maybe there are other attacks like that, but I don't know. I'm wondering if this was something first introduced in Resident Evil 4. If that's the case, then it's definitely a bad part of Resident Evil 4 that carried on to multiple entries in the series. But I don't really count Resident Evil 4 in that category, given how much it's a great game. But Revelations 2, that issue really stands out to me, especially with the Revenants. I don't really notice it as much with... Actually, I do notice it a lot with the Ironheads, I think. Not so much with the other enemies. But be careful of the Ironheads, be careful of the Revenants if they decide to attack you through the geometry. It is an issue that is pretty major in this game, so bear that in mind. But Capcom has announced some new things with the Resident Evil series. So they're actually putting out a PS5 upgrade for Resident Evil 7, Resident Evil 2 Remake, and Resident Evil 3 Remake, which I am very happy to hear. I'm most excited for Resident Evil 7, given that it's my favorite game in the series, and that game is masterfully crafted from the heart and soul. But Resident Evil 2 Remake and Resident Evil 3 Remake, I don't know if it's worth doing any kind of PS5 upgrade for those games, because I hate Resident Evil 2 Remake, and I haven't played that game in almost a year. The last time I played that game was when I recorded Leon 2 for my knife-only run of that game. I mean, it should really be a knife-only walkthrough, given that walkthrough basically implies that the way I'm playing is the baseline way to play, and it's actually practical to do, and knife-only feels practical to do on Resident Evil 2 Remake. So that's why it's not called a run. But basically, I don't see myself upgrading Resident Evil 2 Remake to the PS5. I might do it with Resident Evil 3 Remake, but I don't think so, though, because I haven't really found a lot of urge to go back to Resident Evil 3 Remake. And as much as I do like that game more so than Resident Evil 2 Remake, it's still a pretty average game, and it's a short game, not much really happens, and Inferno difficulty embraces a lot of poor designs. And I don't know if it's really worth replaying like multiple times. Like Resident Evil 7 warrants replaying it multiple times, given how well designed that game is, given how much it's not a cash grab. They put so much heart and soul into that game with the main campaign, with the DLCs, with the characters, with the soundtrack. That game definitely deserves a PS5 upgrade, and I wonder if the load times will be improved as well, because the load times in Resident Evil 7, the only major load time you ever notice is when you're first starting up the game, but you don't really notice any other loading screens aside from when you leave the Baker estate and when you transition between Ethan and Mia. And I don't feel they're that long enough to really warrant any sense of annoyance on my part. So that's why I can tolerate the loading screens, but I just wonder if the PS5 upgrade will improve the loading screen significantly. I mean, I doubt it, though, because I don't really see why old Capcom, or I guess new Capcom in this case, would be running the PS5 upgrade. I mean, I don't see why they would need to change the load times. I doubt they'll really put a lot of effort into it. I know they're improving the visuals, and I think they're improving the frame rate as well. Even though I never noticed any frame rate issues with Resident Evil 7. That game is optimized really well. But if it's going to be even more optimized, that's fantastic. I do hope they improve the HDR, though, for Resident Evil 7 if it is getting remastered for PS5. Because what I've noticed is when I'm playing Resident Evil 7 on my 4K TV with HDR enabled, the HDR is buggy. Because, for one thing, it disables my ability to capture any sort of footage of Resident Evil 7. And also, the HDR, there are times where the game can look very dark, and then other times it looks very bright. And anytime I try to change the numeric value for the HDR, it doesn't fix the issue at all. Instead, it makes the issue even worse. So that's why I don't play Resident Evil 7 with any 4K settings or HDR enabled, because the HDR is broken on Resident Evil 7. Oh, and this right here, this was a mess up. I missed both of my bricks because depth perception prevented me from actually perceiving how far that guy was, even though it looked like the arc was actually touching that guy. So I therefore had to resort to this mechanic of using Natalia to point out where the guy is, and the mechanic is poorly constructed. Like, the times when Natalia doesn't say anything, even though my reticle is perfectly on the glass, and then at times she tells you to shoot, you shoot, and then you don't hit the glass. Like, the mechanic is badly implemented, the quotes that Natalia says are improperly placed, and it's just a cumbersome mechanic to use. Don't rely upon that mechanic. Just try to use Natalia's brick to your advantage, because you don't have to put up with that kind of clunky system. And also, you might have noticed that Natalia went down, and I did touch the glass, but it didn't kill me. This is something I discovered on accident, but it seems that when the glass takes down your AI partner, there is a period of time where its hitbox is completely disabled, so it's unable to attack you. And I use this to my advantage in Claire 4, because in Claire 4, the only way you're going to be able to see the glass is if you have a smokescreen bottle. But you can completely bypass the need to use the smokescreen bottles and kill the glass by getting Mara downed by the glass and then reviving her and then running right past the glass, because the glass is too slow to actually down you or your partner after you revive the partner very quickly. So that is a pretty interesting discovery to make, and it served me very well because I was able to get past that glass just then and use the bricks to my advantage. But now we have Mutant Pedro, and this is a dreadful encounter because the windows for punishing Pedro are so low. He moves around so much. the reticle makes it very hard to accurately aim at these weak spots, and you have to juggle between Barry and Natalia so that you can get Natalia to actually reveal where the weak spot is. You know what would be really great? Why not have it where AI Natalia can actually point at the weak spots, and then you get that HUD icon that indicates where the weak spot is, because there is a mechanic like this in co-op. Whenever the player playing as Natalia points to a weak spot on an enemy, both of you get a circle over that weak spot, so you don't have to waste time finding out where the weak spot is, because you both get that circle over the enemy's weak spot. That makes it easy for Barry to discern where exactly the weak spot is. But like, having said that, why not have it where the circle is always on this guy's weak spot at all times? You don't have to swap to Natalia. Like, if she's already seeing where the weak spot is, in order to properly convey this information in place of the ability for Natalia to actually say anything to Barry, why not just have it where the circle is always on Barry's screen at all times? It's a completely parallel scenario. Like, parallel to the whole scenario of just swapping to Natalia and just trying to discern where this weak spot is through a very cumbersome process. In a parallel scenario, the circle that indicates where the weak spot is always on Barry's screen at all times. They're both the same kind of scenario, only one favors the exclusion of a mechanic, and one has the inclusion of a mechanic. Like, it's no different to what I discussed before in Claire 2, when I was discussing why the whole ability to use that door exploit to your advantage is no different to the parallel scenario of having a last known position mechanic and actually using stealth appropriately to actually deal with the enemies that lost you when they were chasing you. Like, this is what I mean when I say this fight could have been so much better, but it's dreadful. And the only time you're ever going to get an opening to hit Pedro's weak spot is if he does the running attack. Because when he does the running attack, if he clips into a wall, his drill will be stuck in the wall for a bit, and you can use this to your advantage to actually hit the weak spot. And also, with the placement of certain weak spots, the hitbox on some of these weak spots, like for instance that one right under his arm, at times your bull will prioritize other parts of his body because the hitbox is very specific on the weak spots. I use the assault rifle here, and there's a reason why I put damage 3 on the assault rifle. It's so I can just get rid of these weak spots very quickly. Admittedly, I probably should have used the pistol for this, because I believe with damage 3 on the pistol, it takes like 1 or 2 shots. But I felt like I was going to be using the pistol for something later on, so that's why I opted to use the assault rifle. But you see what I mean when I'm saying, like, this process is very cumbersome? I swapped to Natalia just then, and of course Barry is standing still because I'm telling Natalia to wait. And when you tell a partner to wait, if you swap to that partner, the character you were just playing as is also waiting as well. So I have to run the risk of Barry getting hit by Pedro in order to take the time to actually see where the weak spot is. And of course Natalia is actively turning, so it's affecting my ability to actually look in the correct direction to see where Pedro is. Like, this is a recipe for disaster. There are so many opportunities for this fight to go wrong. And you can take Pedro to other parts of this building. You don't have to stay on this floor. But this floor is the most open part of the building, and you do not want to be trapped in a room with Pedro. And that right there, he did not put his drill into the wall, because I wasn't anywhere near the wall when I chose to dodge him. So you gotta make sure you're kind of near the walls to increase the chances of Pedro actually embedding his drill into the wall and giving yourself time to actually hit his weak spots. But this guy has some of the same movesets as the Chainsaw Man from Resident Evil 5 and also from Resident Evil 6. Only he's way more shit in his designs, because his room just isn't complementary to the whole idea of having a chainsaw-wielding man just rapidly swiping his chainsaw over and over again, and with impeccable tracking as well. But that right there, I finally finished him off. There is actually a medal you can go for where you have to kill Pedro without shooting any of his weak spots, but why would you favor a non-Resident Evil format? Obviously, the Resident Evil way is to hit his weak spots, but if it was presented in a better format and the weak spots actually had better hit detection, and you didn't have to waste time just getting Pedro to put his drill into the wall, then it would feel a lot more like Resident Evil design. But I can't really say that's Resident Evil design for sure. And maybe you can use the smoke bottle to your advantage to slow down Pedro, but I imagine he'd be rapidly swiping his chainsaw at thin air if he was blinded. It feels like this is that kind of game where the enemies, when they're blinded, they will actually try to attack you. And this is why I'm reluctant to use the smoke bottle against Pedro. And plus, the smoke bottles have utilities for later parts of the game. And you only have a limited amount of crafting supplies. You can only find crafting supplies in the open world. I say open world, I mean, it's just a linear environment. This is not an open world game. I just mean, like, in the game world in general. And I didn't want to waste it on something stupid like that, when I could just be relying upon that method, which is very dangerous because the number of opportunities Pedro had to hit me, I'm lucky he didn't hit me. But that is really the last encounter of Barry 2, and we have a bit of time to just search the area for supplies. And of course, because I'm not picking up any herbs, the chances of me getting herbs from these shiny spots is increased greatly, so I'm losing out on resources in the process of doing this. But hey, it adds an interesting challenge to this. But all that's left to do now is go inside this building, and there is a chest that has an emerald inside of it. And there are also some supplies in this area. I don't know why they give you bricks here when there are no enemies. I think it's because there's some kind of collectible for Natalia, because there is a collectible for Natalia where you have to use bricks to destroy these bugs that only Natalia can see. But that's all you have to note for Barry 2. And I'm just going to skip on ahead to the skill tree system. So you'll just be seeing all the skills I'm going to be upgrading. So I'm going to upgrade the Moira's crowbar damage, and I'll also be trying to contribute to the skills necessary to unlock the ability to do more damage with your knife, because most likely it'll be very reliable in dealing with one enemy type in Barry 3 that is a mandatory encounter. And this will conclude Barry 2. Stay tuned for the future episodes. Thank you all for watching, and you take care now.